Welcome to our listeners to this webinar, which is hosted by Extra in collaboration with EXALT. And today's webinar is called Is Extractivism a Prime Cause of the Polycrisis? A discussion of the political economy of anthropogenic existential risk. Allow me just to say a few words first about Extra. Extra is an initiative of the World Academy of Arts and Science, and we look at existential threats and risks to all, hence the abbreviation Extra. And that means we try and understand all the different threats and risks that humanity is facing at this time and in the foreseeable future. We provide an information service with some of the very best reports on existential risks, and you might know that there are more than 100 organizations on our list that provide such reports, rather an overwhelming information flood, and we try and simplify that, gather the best reports for our users and on our website. And we have a directory of these reports, these curated best reports according to theme. And we also run a monthly newsletter with updates that keep you abreast of the latest information on existential risk. And of course, we're also interested in solutions, and our webinars are designed to discuss these risks and how they interact and what we can do about them. And our last webinar was on polycrisis, trying to get an understanding of how different existential risks are converging. And we noted that this kind of complexity makes it very hard for policymakers to decide what needs to be done. And in this webinar, we're actually thinking to simplify that task by taking it back to some of the underlying causes. And one of those causes, we believe, is extractivism, a particular mode that is characteristic of our political economy globally and has been for considerable time. So, and this political economy, one could say, is one typical feature is that there's a certain brazen attitude towards nature and also towards other people, a belief that we must take all before somebody else does, rather than only taking the minimum to survive. So it's linked to a sort of a certain excess, both at the level of extraction but also consumption. So extraction and consumption are two sides of the same coin. Okay, I would like Barry to say a few words about EXALT and the work that you do in your organization. Barry.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, everyone. Well, EXALT is the Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative, and it was founded some years ago by colleagues at the University of Helsinki Global Development Studies and myself. When we had a period of reflection, we thought that extractivism was actually an extremely valuable conceptual tool, and it could be a very central organizing concept in the kind of work we did in global development studies and global political economy. And we formed a working group, and we have a very intense set of studies for about a year, where we produced an article which you can find in the Journal of Peasant Studies about extractivism as an organizing concept, its genealogy and its variety of meanings and new meanings, including data extractivism now. And we have produced a great many papers, academic papers, which are in our archive, and also many symposia, and a podcast series, which I highly recommend. And so you can find our material, all of it, and links to it on our website, which is www.exalt.fi. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. And I would like to introduce the speakers one by one. And we've changed the order a bit because it's very late here in Australia, and that is affecting Hamid and myself. And Hamid will speak first. And the title of his uh, short address is Beyond Compartmentality, Commonization as a Response to the Polycrisis. Hamid is from Newcastle University in Australia, in New South Wales. And he's a fellow of VAS and the convener of the Common Alternatives Initiative. So, Hamid, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you so
And
much. Thank you, Thomas, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm joining you from the the beautiful land of Awabakal and Boromai people. If I understand that we all have a lot to share, so if that's okay, if I would quickly share my slides and read out from the text just to save time as much as I can. I have been prepared for more than 10 minutes, so you may stop me whenever it's necessary. So um,
I think you can
okay,
just share. Yeah.
I can share. I'm not sure if that's going to, that doesn't seem to be the, uh, so I think, well, it seems that I'm not sure if that's I'm sharing. It was supposed to
Yes.
share another screen.
Yep. Yeah, we can see it. You just might want to
But this is,
maximize.
yeah, sorry, this shouldn't be the one that I was supposed to share. I'm not sure what's happening actually. Um, okay, I made it. Um, that would be a little bit difficult for me to. um, that's not the one I was supposed to share. Sorry.
The title seems to be correct.
Yes, but this is not what I was supposed to share. I was supposed to share a different format of this. If that's okay, if someone else go ahead and I will
You go
see
up your
what's going
screen
on.
and you have the display settings, and then you change here.
Okay, maybe this one.
Yeah, you swap.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, that's good.
Oh, okay, then okay, maybe I have to change it again. Apologies.
And you're not sharing now. You're not sharing screen. Okay, now it's coming. Okay. Yep.
Okay, maybe I have to read it from another screen. Yeah, climate breakdown, biodiversity collapse, widening inequality, democratic erosion, pandemics, mass displacement. We have grown used to calling this the polycrisis. The term signals that these are not isolated problems that, sorry, these are not isolated problems, but interconnected, mutually reinforcing crises. However, our responses remains remains stubbornly fragmented. Climate, social, and economic policies remain locked in their own silos, frequently working at cross purposes. At the very moment that convergence is most urgent, divergence intensifies, fueled by rising ethnocentric nationalism, growing conflicts between established and emerging powers, and the erosion of the international order by its very founders. This divergence is not a separate problem from the polycrisis. It is part of the crisis itself. Perhaps its deepest layer, a meta-crisis of being unable to respond coherently to interconnected crises. The, The usual prescriptions like better coordination, more interdisciplinary research, holistic frameworks assumes fragmentation is an intellectual or administrative failure. But if that were so, decades of sustainability science and system thinking should have made more headway. The argument I want to make is that both converging crises and our fragmenting responses share a common structural root, which is the architecture of modern capitalist societies that generates crises as apparently separate while simultaneously preventing coherent responses. In societies organized around commoning, and many such formations existed before capitalism and persist in various forms today, the activities we now separate into economic, social, ecological, and political domains were woven together. Production, care, spirituality, governance, and relationship with land formed an organic whole. This is not to romanticize pre-capitalist societies, many of which had their own hierarchies and divisions. But the specific compartmentalization we take for granted today, where the economy operates as an autonomous sphere governed by its own laws, disembedded from nature, society, and political authority, is distinctly modern. It emerged with patriarchal colonialist capitalism and was essential to capitalism's functioning. What happened? The rise of capitalism required breaking apart these organic connections. Commons like shared lands, waters, forests, knowledge systems, care networks, collective decision-making practices had to be enclosed, privatized, destroyed, or at best relegated to a third sector subordinate to the dominant private and public spheres. This process, which may call decommunization, did not merely transfer resources from collective to private hands, it fundamentally restructured how different dimensions of life relate to each other. Think of it this way. In a common way of life, creativity, how we make and do things, livability, the material conditions that sustain us, conviviality, how we live well together, and alterity, our capacity to imagine and build different futures, are deeply intertwined. They flow into and reinforce each other like organs in a living body. But capital cannot operate on such an organic whole. It needs to extract, measure, and accumulate, and you cannot extract from a living relationship without first severing it. Capital must separate these dimensions, turn them into distinct modules that can be independently managed, priced, and exploited. Labor abstracted from its social meaning, nature reduced to raw materials, care commodified or made visible, political imagination constrained to managing what already exists. The result is what I call compartmentality, a world divided into isolated domains, each governed by its own specialized logic, each blind to the others. Compartmentality is not just a way of thinking, it is a structural outcome of decommunizations. Under capitalism, our creative capacity becomes labor to be exploited. Our living environments become natural resources to be extracted. Our communities become markets to be penetrated. Our political imagination becomes constrained to managing what exists rather than building what could be. These are the four faces of capitalist power: exploitative, extractivist, manipulative, and domineering, operating in separate components with no organic connection between them. This helps explain why our responses to the polycrisis so consistently fail. Carbon trading treats emissions as an isolated variable to be optimized through markets, while the social relations that produce emissions and the communities harmed by both extraction and its supposed solutions remain invisible. Sustainable development promises to balance economic growth with environmental protections and social inclusion, but the very grammar of balancing assumes these are separate things that need to be traded off against each other. Even critical movements often reproduce compartmentality, an environmental movement that overlooks labor, a labor movement that takes ecology too lightly, identity politics severed from political economy, each fights on its own train, unable to see how the trains are connected because under capitalism, they have been structurally disconnected. The result is what we might call civilizing metamechanisms, reforms that manage the worst symptoms without challenging the underlying structures. Environmental regulations, social welfare programs, corporate sustainability pledges, these may help, but they also stabilize the system of compartmentalization, making capitalism more tolerable without making it less destructive. If compartmentality results from decommunization, the response must be re/communization, actively rebuilding the organic connections that capital has severed. But here we need an important distinction. Commoning refers to the practices through which existing commons sustain themselves: stewardship, reciprocity, collective decision-making, regeneration. Think of traditional irrigation system, indigenous land management, or a community garden where neighbors share tools and harvest. These are commoning in action, and they are precious. Recommunization, by contrast, names the transformative project of creating or restoring commons from conditions of decommunization. It is not just maintaining what exists, but actively challenging and restructuring the compartmentalized architecture of capitalist society. Recommunization is explicitly political. This distinction matters because commoning alone builds alternatives within capitalist conditions is perpetually vulnerable. A food cooperative may operate beautifully internally, but find itself forced to compete on capitalist terms externally, gradually adopting the very logic it sought to escape. It is not failure of will, it is a structural pressure. This is why recommunization requires what I call a dual strategy, building alternatives from below while simultaneously contesting the political and legal structures that enforce compartmentalization. Neither alone is sufficient. Grassroots commoning without political struggles that challenge and change the system in its entirety remains marginal, vulnerable to absorption or suppression. But political movements without rooted alternatives become empty. They may win elections, but lack the institutional forms to actually recognize, to actually reorganize society. The two must develop together, each strengthening the other. What might this look like? Imagine a municipality that declares water to be legal commons. The water utility is reconstituted overnight, not as a state bureaucracy or private company, but as a public common institution governed by workers, users, indigenous custodians, communities, and ecological guardians together. This is what we may call a switch, a discrete transformation that changes the default logic governing an essential commons. But here is the crucial point. Switches do not accumulate automatically into systemic change. Without political movements actively defending and extending them, switches can be reversed, isolated, or undermined. A progressive water authority can be defunded by hostile state government. A network of cooperatives can be outcompeted by subsidized corporations. The thresholds where recommunization become irreversible is not reached by quietly building alternatives until one day the system tips over. It must be fought for through political parties and movements that directly challenge the power structures, maintaining compartmentalization, that contest elections, that push for constitutional change, that uses strikes and boycotts and civil disobedience to create crises the system cannot absorb. The multiplications
please come to a conclusion sort of in about a minute or so. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me then maybe switch to... Okay, getting back to our webinar question, is extractivism a prime cause of polycrisis? Yes, but only if we understand extractivism as one phase of a deeper structure. Extraction of minerals, forests, water, labor, and data all depend on the prior decommunization that severed these from their organic connections and made them available as isolated resources to be exploited. The four forms of capitalist power, exploitative, extractivist, manipulative, and domineering, operate in compartment precisely because decommunization created these compartments. And finally, this means the polycrisis cannot be solved by better coordination across existing domains. What is required is the transformation of those domains themselves, their recommunization into organically interconnected forms of life. This is not utopian dreaming. The communist impulse already exists in movements and organizations that refuse compartmentalized thinking. When people can point to actually existing farms, cooperatives, municipals, and care networks that operate according to a different logic and that visibly work better than their compartmentalized counterparts, the claim that alternatives are possible becomes materially grounded. But these alternatives will only survive and spread if they are defended by movements willing to contest power directly. This is how we move beyond compartmentality, not by thinking our way out, but by building and fighting our way through. Thank you so much for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Hamed. Certainly rings a bell. What you said about the dual strategies, very much also what I saw in social movements, farmers' movements in Indonesia, who trying to make change from below, and at the same time also struggling for changes in the political framing conditions in which they operate. Okay, our next speaker is Audwin Ren, who is Director of Systemic Risk Research at Extra, and Professor Emeritus of Environmental Sociology and Technological Assessment at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. Audwin, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you also, Hamed, for your contribution. Since we have only very limited time, I would like to really focus my contribution to two major theses. The first thesis is any kind of extraction, and that was just reinforced by the previous speaker, is a violation of sustainability. And that is true for all kinds of mining, that of course is a focus, but also in other sorts of excavation. And why is that so? Well, first thing is the resources that we dig out and that we use in the form of mining is normally not renewable. And that means we will take away resources from the earth and we will not be able to bring them back into their original state. Secondly, very often they're related to emissions and they're related to waste. So if you look at the whole cycle, we'll find out that the kind of material that we use is not very beneficial for the environment. And thirdly, a lot of these material have also negative impacts on health, specifically if they are either inhaled or taken up by food. This can be prevented to some extent, or at least can be minimized. But overall, it's very clear that if we want to continue with mining, we will violate specific principles of sustainability as they have been, for example, engraved into the sustainability goals of the UN. And now comes my second point. We will not have sustainability if we don't have mining. And that makes it a really very important contradiction. Most of the things that we try to do in terms of a sustainable future, specifically in terms of energy, is reliant on having minerals and metals available. There will be no sustainability in the world without metals and minerals, and those metals and minerals need to come at least to a large degree from mining. If you think about, for example, the energy transition, you can say if you want to have photovoltaic panels, and that is part of the transformation towards renewable energy, of course, solar energy, you need silicon, you need silver, you need copper, you need aluminum, you need for thin film materials, cadmium, thallium, gallium, you name it. And that is very important. Otherwise, it won't work. I mean, there's no substitute of organic material that you could use whatever or produce organically is not there. And so we are reliant on these things. If you talk about wind turbines, you need steel and iron. I mean, that's very clear, but you also need copper, you need rare earth elements. We all know them: neodymium, praseodymium, cytonium. Well, all the funny names they have, they're very important, because otherwise these windmills will not produce wind energy. And of course, aluminum is another major element there. And for battery storage, electric vehicles, well, we know we need lithium, we need graphite, we need cobalt and nickel, manganese, and vanadium. And if you talk about grids and grid expansion, I mean, we could go on and go on and go on. I think what might be a good thing to see, or a good comparison, is that an onshore wind plant, I mean, of the same capacity, requires around 10 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired power plant, given the same outcome. So we are really left with a very difficult contradiction. We know that mining does violate sustainability, but we also know that mining is absolutely essential for sustainability. So where does it leave us? Well, there are three major lessons that we talk. First is, we'll never be able to be fully sustainable. That's something, I mean, with approaching 9 billion and 10 billion people, that's already not a natural stage for sustainability. We'll have to make some compromises, as bitter as they may appear, but we will not have full sustainability. Secondly, we can be more sustainable. And that also reaches out to issues of mining. First saying the mining activity itself, and I think Richard will, of course, devote part of his talk about this, can be made much more sustainable than it is now, specifically in terms of landscape engineering, in terms of extraction technology, in terms of how it's being produced, but also how it's being transported and how it's being used. So it can be made more efficient, it can be more benign with environmental concerns. So there is very much room for improvement. Thirdly, there is a very strong demand for recycling, first for reuse. Very many things can be reused, specifically if they're metal. They can be recycled. And if they can't be recycled, at least they can be processed in a way that is not so detrimental to the environment. And last thing is, they need to be isolated from human exposure. So those are the four elements that we do: first reuse, second recycle, third process, fourth isolate. And again, that can be done with metals and minerals, and it's not done to a degree that we would like it to be done. We cannot 100% recycle these materials. I mean, that also should be clearly stated. So we should not lie to ourselves. We should not betray ourselves. We always believe you need new material, and the more we have the transformation towards renewable energy systems, the more we would need these minerals. And that is even more a plea from my side to say, be as sustainable as possible, knowing that it's not 100% sustainable. So we'll never get to the extreme, but we can get it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ortwin. And I think you've already mentioned Richard's work is related to mining as well. And I was wondering, Richard, if you don't mind going next, because you're also going to speak about mining. And I think June and I will both be speaking about agriculture. So in a way, it makes more sense to cluster it that way. Is that okay? You're still muted.
Well,
Yeah, okay.
I will do that. So let me share my screen. And I think it makes sense to follow Ortwin. As you know, we want a more sustainable society, and one of the way to go is to go into a circular economy, and Ortwin touched a little bit about that. So I will have to go a little bit fast on that, but the idea is instead of a linear economy, to put back some product into the loop so that we minimize waste and that we don't need resources. So that goes quite well with what the talk is about today, or the seminar. So that is a definition that is provided by Ellen MacArthur's Foundation. So you see that it is not only one cycle. I don't have time to go too much into detail, but just know that there is not one solution for any product. So we have to find solutions that are convergent. So, but if you talk in terms of technology, as Ortwin said, we face a very, very strong conundrum, because at the same time, we want to reduce the energy consumption and reduce our demand on non-renewable energy. But by doing that, we increase the demand, and it means that we need more resources. At the same time, we have technology issues, so we want, of course, to reuse, repair, remanufacture, and the most important one is recycling. And I will show you that introduces a second paradox that is very, very important to do. And what I want to say is about reducing waste. So Ortwin showed that, so I don't need to go too much into details, but I think it's very important. So the first paradox is that by demanding non-renewable energy for the foreseeable future, we will have a very, very, very strong increase in the demand of materials that are not in the loop yet. So it means that we need to extract them in order to put them in the loop. So Ortwin talked about rare earths, but it's a lot of these minerals that are on the critical raw material list provided, for example, by the EU, but in the US as well. And if you look on the right side, you see that just due to the fact that our population are increasing, our demand is also increasing, and that also in the foreseeable future, the product that can be recycled remains mostly stable, with a little bit of increase in the 2040s and 20, but that will never replace primary raw materials. And I will show you a little bit why. And we had a very, very big project with BMW, for example. So it was funded by the German government to try to find out how much of a car can be recycled into a car. And you would be surprised, because what what we have to take care of is something like that. Those are real product of electronic waste, and you see that it's extremely complicated. And if you look at what you get at the end, so those are for quite a few of the metals, you see that the recycling rate, beside a few elements, is extremely low and will remain low. And there is a reason for that. So here, bear with me, because it is very important. When you use a metal, it will be transformed. Some of it will be new scrap and will be recovered, and some of it will be used as a product, and then it must be collected and then recycled. But if you look at this table here, it shows you the amount of raw product you need in order to recycle. And you see that it is never 100%. So it means that the more we recycle, the more we need primary raw materials. So that is very important. There is no technological situation in which we can recycle 100%. So it might be the case in a very, very long time, but for the foreseeable future, that it is not the case. So here, more recycle means more production of raw materials. So the question is that what does it mean for mining? And here I think it's something that is very important. We know where to mine, so there are technologies to do that. But the main aspect that is a barrier to mining is the social acceptance, and understandably so. We have to deal with that. So it's very, very important to understand. So it means that at the end of the day, right now the situation is, because of this polycrisis you were talking about, we need more energy from certain types. That means that because of that, we will need more resources. Because we want to recycle, we need more resources. It means that right now we are producing more emission and more waste due to the fact that we want to reduce the use on primary raw materials. So we had a few projects, some of them in collaboration with Ortwin Uren, where we try to look at what are the solutions. And the solutions are multiple, because of course it's not only an environmental problem, it's a social problem, it's a governmental problem. What is the first thing is that we need new business model for mining. So it cannot be led by limited and short time gain, but it must be a long time effort. And right now, the way mines are financed, they cannot be sustainable because they have to provide short-term benefits to the shareholders. So that is something that is very important. At the same time, it is very important to engage with local communities, and that the local communities who will have most of the negative aspect of mining right now are not the one who benefit from it. So those are two examples of results that we had. We had several projects looking into it. And the last one is called Mosmin. And here what we are looking at is mining produce a lot of waste. So you have to understand that if you are lucky, you have 5% of ore in a mine. So it means that at least 95% of what we extract is waste. And that has a huge amount of consequences. The first one is that you need a lot of energy to extract and process minerals because they are rare. Yeah? So 5%. And then you produce a lot of waste. How can we minimize waste? That means that also how we can recycle these things. So, and I want to summarize with one of the papers that we produced a couple of years ago with colleagues. We have several choices, and Ortvin went a little bit on that. So either we keep it as it is and we let the market regulate mining, and it means that we will go to what Hamed was saying about. So we have social and environmental fragmentation, we have resource nationalism, and environmental issues. Or we can use another extreme. So mining as a motor for sustainability, as long-term well-being. We try to reduce waste, so zero waste. We have natural positive solutions that are, for example, the invisible mines where there is no waste at the surface, where there is a very limited amount of impact on the environment. And that the mining is not just to make money, but it has a long-term purpose. And that includes also recycling, because where you have a lot of mining means you have also an infrastructure for the extraction. A lot of energy is there for the extraction. It would make sense that there is a cradle-to-cradle solution. And also a fair access to resources to everyone. I think we all agree into that. And on that, I will stop my introduction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. And I should have mentioned before that Richard is the head of exploration technology at the Helmholtz Institute for Resource Technology in Freiburg. My talk is next, and I'm going to talk about a very different resource. I'm going to talk about food and agriculture, which is different from mining because it's, at least in some sense, renewable. So let me just share my screen first of all. Okay. Okay. Just a second. Okay. Is that okay? Is that good? Yep. So I'm looking at extractivism in food systems as an amplifier of risk. First of all, I want to connect it to the theme today. This is the latest country overshoot day report, one of the reports we review in our next newsletter. What it shows is that extractivism, or extractivism as it was originally called in the South American context, is something that is quite typical of the colonial model, or colonialism in a way set the scene for a kind of a resource injustice, whereby resources were mobilized from all over the world to sustain a particular way of life in the European colonial powers. And this kind of pattern has not gone away. It still continues. So we still have certain countries on the right of this chart, where, wealthy countries where a lot of the consumption takes place, and others where the extraction takes place and much less consumption. It doesn't always coincide, but the crucial point here is that, say, if we were all Americans, then we would run out of resources on the 14th of March. Our annual budget would run out. Whereas if you're in Honduras, we all would live like people in Honduras. It would be the 27th of November. So there's huge disjunctures in the amount of resources people use in different countries. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there's a correlation between, this is a Human Development Index, between human development and extraction consumption. So the more development, the higher the Human Development Index score, the higher is also the ecological footprint. But correlation is not destiny. It takes an effort to disconnect the two. But we can see, if you look at this graph here, there are certain dots that come close to the Global Sustainable Development Quadrant at the bottom right. In other words, some countries manage to live within the confines of what Earth has to offer, or almost, whereas others would require 10 times as much to achieve the same development level. So they're choices. And that's really what it's about, realizing that we do have choices. So I want to now speak about food specifically, which I've worked on for the last 15 years. There are two risk sources. One is associated with demand and supply. And on the supply side, there are follow-on risks, ecological, distribution risks, and political risks. So I'll go through these so you don't have to worry about it too much right now. So on the demand side, of course, population growth, has already been mentioned, is a huge factor. And we had this massive increase in world population, but you can see that thin red line, the growth rate has dropped dramatically, and we expect to peak in about 2085. But there's an extra 2 million people to come if things continue as expected. Okay. The problem, though, is not just the number of people on the planet, but how much we consume. And again, we get into this issue of justice. The fact is that in some parts of the world, food consumption is much higher and much more meat-based, and has a much higher environmental impact than in other regions. And the problem is that those other regions would like to live the way Europeans and Americans do. And that will mean massive increases in the amount of meat consumption and massive increases in the environmental footprint that's associated with that. So that's the other source of increased demand, simply changes in lifestyle and diet. Overall, on the supply side, the problem is that this massive population increase that we had, in a way, forced us to have a different form of agriculture, the Green Revolution, it's often called, industrial agriculture. And on the other hand, that Green Revolution made that population growth possible, or it's largely responsible for it. So there's a close interaction there. Now we've managed to increase yield, the amount of production per hectare, quite massively, and that way we managed to actually reduce world hunger, even though population grew. But we are not going to be able to keep doing that while yields are expected to keep rising. That's the solid lines in the projection side of the diagram. It can't keep up with demand. So there's a gap, and we're really heading for very serious crisis. And if you look at the right-hand graph, it shows grain production per capita. And if you look at it at that, then you can see that there's actually less per person available in terms of grains. Okay, so we have a big problem. And the problem is also that we've pushed the Green Revolution methodology, the extractivist form of agriculture, as far as it will go. We are now confronted with depleted soils, with depleted water resources, and so on. So that model, there was a cost at that, increasing the production massively for a short time. It proved to be possible, but it's not a long-term model. It doesn't work in the long term. One of the things that this model has caused is that we've basically pushed nature into a corner. If you look at mammals, for example, and see that there's just 4 little blocks. This is actually an amount of carbon in the biomass, as it's called. So you can see that wild animals are dwarfed by the number of human beings on the planet, let alone our domestic animals. You can see that the animals we raise for meat production are actually a very big factor in the marginalization of nature. I used to work for IPBES, the biodiversity panel of the UN. Okay, so this is global land use for agriculture. And so with land use change their carbon emissions, and also in the whole process of production. And overall, agriculture contributes about 1/3 of all carbon emissions. So it's a very big contributor to climate change. Also depletes water and erodes soil. I already mentioned that. And much of it has to do with diet. So this diet shift that we're seeing worldwide in places like India and China towards a more meat-based diet is really means we need more and more space to feed humanity. And space we don't have because we've already finished clearing most of the forests. So that's also a sort of an expansionist model that reaches its limits and has arguably gone already way too far. Now, because of that and other human activities, we have environmental risks emerging that threaten our food supply. This one is water security. And you can see that large parts of the world are really threatened by a lack of water. And these are exactly the parts of the world that are already food insecure. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and so on. Right. Another environmental issue is, of course, climate change, and it's going to affect yields negatively in most parts of the world. And if you look at the places that may actually benefit a little, well, try and find Ukraine there, find what is it, the 52nd state of the US, Canada. The kind of tensions we have today, the conflicts, are not unrelated to these shifts. So there are already, around the world, security policies that now look at food security as something that is part of overall security. And they know very well where food might be found in the future and are thinking about that. Okay, and finally, we have distribution risks and political risks. The problem is that it's the poorest countries that are always the first victims, and the poorest people in rich countries increasingly also. Food prices are rising fast everywhere, and affordability is dropping. And it's already more or less the norm if you look at the world in terms of geography, to be food insecure or to struggle. And the way we relate to food, and that goes back to what Hamed said earlier, is very different. We used to be pretty food sovereign. That means food was produced locally by local people for other local people. That has changed. So we're very market dependent, and that market is run by cartels. Most of the wheat and grain is controlled by just 1 or 2 companies. Retail, the same. So we have this sort of globalized market that's controlled by large corporations, and we have no control over food production anymore ourselves, or it's very remote for most people. They just experience food through the supermarket. So it wasn't always like that. Let me just quickly contrast traditional and extractivist methods in agriculture from my own research in Indonesia. What I found is that people in my research area had these forest gardens where you had hundreds of different crops in a very small space. So very, very highly biodiverse, ecologically sustainable. There was no pollution or waste. Everything was circular already. Yeah, okay. We are struggling to find circularity. It was already there. We must not forget that. So, and the aim of this, all this food production in the traditional mode was to feed people, to keep them healthy. And it all happened in a community context where you knew everybody is involved, and there's a strong social relationship between food producers and consumers. There isn't a gap. And of course, lots of food sovereignty and high food security, because these biodiverse systems are highly resilient. The diet was basically organic, unprocessed, and very healthy. And then suddenly I saw, within a span of about 30 years that I've been observing this part of Indonesia. I can't show you all the picture, it would take too long. But I saw that, you know, a huge, massive deforestation, a change to open fields, to just 2 or 3 cash crops, use of toxic inputs, waste. Basically, an extractivist method was introduced very quickly. The whole ecosystem was pretty much destroyed or highly compromised. And the aim of this new way of doing things is to make money as quickly as possible. People's lifestyle had changed. They had suddenly discovered different needs that required cash. So there was a cash economy emerged. And the context for this food production is the market. Okay, and food sovereignty was basically lost, and food security is also precarious. Most importantly, the diet of people in that region changed very quickly. I'm actually talking about the highland region of Bali, where I did my PhD research. So I have this long-term perspective on it. And of course, then you have massive incidence of non-communicable diseases. What's the answer? What can we do? And my finding is, and I wrote a book about it, is that small farmers, it turns out, actually feed 2/3 of the world by producing healthy food on less than 1/4 of the arable land. So there is an alternative to extractivist industrial farming, which produces mainly sugar and fat, biofuels, oils, and so on, and has a much larger carbon footprint. So in a way, small is beautiful, to quote Schumacher, the famous economist, very much a visionary. Okay, and like Ahmed said earlier, you know, there you have this twofold strategy. In Indonesia, people are waking up to these issues, and farmers are, out of their own accord, turning to sustainable methods. So there you have the grassroots component, and then you have political activism to change the framework conditions, because those conditions are not helpful. They're actually geared towards supporting large farming, large operators that are not sustainable. Okay. Right. I hope I didn't go over the time. It's hard to monitor yourself. But anyway, okay. Hold on. Hold on to get back to my other document. All right. I would like to ask Jun Boras, who's professor of agrarian studies at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, to speak next and his topic is land politics and agroecological transition. Over to you, Jun.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello to everyone, and thanks to be here. Well, my task has been simplified because of the presentation of Thomas. We have a lot of overlap in terms of topic and in terms of positioning on this particular issues. My overall key message is that when we talk about a big umbrella just transition, it will never happen, and we cannot even begin to imagine it without talking about agrarian or agroecological transition component of it. There's just no way. As Thomas just said, up to 1/3 to up to 40% of the GHG contribution comes from the capitalist industrial agriculture. So we need to tackle and address this one single sector. But we cannot begin to even think about agroecological transition without thinking about transitioning about the politics of land. And that becomes quite difficult and easier said than done. Just to very quickly run through some of what Thomas already mentioned, and I'll just bring it to the discussion about agroecological transition and the question of land. Agrarian extractivism, of course, causes polycrisis. And agriculture, you already said, industrial, chemical agriculture extracts quite a bit. And that it generates a lot of different types of crises, deforestation, and the biggest part of it that I would like to emphasize is the extraction of soil fertility from the land, which pushes capitalist agriculture to resort into different ways to resolve that crisis of depletion of soil fertility. And that brings a capitalist strategy to resort further into further extractivism and again extractivism. So it becomes a vicious cycle of extractivism. Soil fertility as food has been commodified. So we see the separation and distance between the site of production and consumption, and the natural ability to reproduce soil nutrients is broken. So in history, of course, capitalism, it was addressed by, at first, grabbing all these animal and human bones from elsewhere, grinding them for fertilizer. But then that is not sufficient. And then, of course, from 1820s for another 100 years was the guano rush globally, when they extract guano from the Peruvian coast to basically make sure that industrial agriculture proceeds. So it's all a story of extractivism. Today, that site of production and consumption continues to widen and generates a lot of problems. Others refer to it as a metabolic rift or ecological rift, tracing back to the original work of Marx. Some ways of very nuanced capitalist forms of extractivism are in the form of it's not always a very crude way of mining or extractivist kind of way, but also ways something like sedentarization as a form of extractivism. When mobile societies, mobile pastoralists, and mobile agriculturalists are being resettled using the attraction of small plots of titled lands, so that the rest of the nature and the space are taken over by big capital. It's a one very important mechanism of extraction. That brings us to land. The very central element of agrarian extractivism is about land. And we said today, the main idea on how to push back and fight against capitalist agrarian extractivism is through agroecological transition, which is the opposite of rupture and distancing and rift between sites of production and consumption, into trying to close that distance through some already mentioned about circular way of production and consumption and waste kind of ways. But that brings us to the question of land. There's no way that we can think about agroecology by thinking about individual plots of farmlands or individual small blocks of grazing land here and there, or landing rights for fishers here and there. However strong and land rights or space rights those are, in fact, part of the problem, even among progressive activists and academics, is to always think about the dominant thinking about land is land in production. So land as a plot of farmland, land as a block of grazing, which is important. But the tendency, even of the most radical agrarian reforms of the past century, was to inadvertently disembed that farm plot of land from its broader organic embeddedness of an agroecological zone and the landscape and nature. And that generates a lot of problems. Now, if we redefine and reframe our understanding of land as land in production and social reproduction broadly defined not only as generational and labor reproduction, but also socio-ecological reproduction, and if you want, cultural and political reproduction, so that land is meant to be soil as a resource, as like farmland, but also as landscape, agroecological zone, and territory and homeland, then we will see a very different way of approaching about the politics of land and how to imagine agroecological transition, and in terms of trying to fight back. So agroecological, but the reality today is that 1% of all farms covers 70% of all lands, and the bottom 40% of all farms cover only 3% of all lands. So it is a profoundly unequal relations based on land. And so any imagination of just transition, of agroecological transition, without fundamentally addressing this property question, then we can even begin to make sense of how we relate a small-scale alternative here to system change imagination. So agroecology, and this is my main point, it's only possible as a closed-loop system of production, consumption, and waste, of managing it, is truly deeply anti-capitalist in its logic, but requires a very urgent and system-wide recasting of the politics of land to make it much more democratic, but not in the way that we have imagined it, even in the most revolutionary movements in the past century of land in production, land as a plot of farmland, but land in production and social reproduction, where human and non-humans interact for what Marx said, the incessant renewal of life and society. I'll end there. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, John, thank you very much. This was very quick, and we want to have some discussion at the end and some questions. So ask Barry to go next. Barry, if you ready? Hello, Barry, are you there? Okay, you might have just walked off. Oh, yeah, okay. All right, if you're ready, Barry, please go ahead. I'll just quickly introduce you. Barry is, apart from being the chair of EXALT, is Professor of Emeritus of Global Development Studies at Helsinki University, and is going to talk about beyond extractivism, recommoning and rewilding nature through the rights of nature. I think it's probably best if you go next, Barry, because it connects better to the last two papers. Thank you. He is still muted.
Okay, thanks. We live in a situation where the level of destruction, which is expressed by global extractivism, upon which the whole capitalist modernity, global political economy is fundamentally based on extractivism on a global scale. It has, as we know, produced a situation in which, according to some metrics, we've already crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We face a situation of accelerating motion towards thresholds in critical tipping points and tipping zones, tipping elements, and we see the possible amplification of the interaction between the tipping zones and the other kinds of patterns. So this level of destruction is so profound and deep that it cannot be sustained. So we face a great implosion of the system and breakdown of ecological systems and all the consequences that bears, which I think we're all aware of broadly with the amount of information we have. So we have a kind of, again, disproportionate allocation of resources globally. For every $1 spent on conservation or protection, stewardship of nature, $30 are spent on destructive practices, which might be twinned with extractivist practices. The world is spending over $7 trillion a year on destructive practices at this time. So we look desperately for solutions. So I wanted to invoke, as Hamid had mentioned in our work earlier, the importance of recommoning. And I do think that recommoning is like an antithesis to some of the foundations of extractivism. And why do I say that? That relates why I wanted to talk about the rights of nature. The rights of nature is a way of using jurisprudence, legislation, legal means in order to grant legal entity standing to ecosystems, to even to single species. It's highly flexible, and it's practiced at any level, from a municipality, a locality, a region, a state, and globally. And there's this way in which, by using these means of the rights of nature, it's not just a constitution in 1 or 2 Latin American countries. This is something which is gaining momentum around the planet. People have seized upon it at all kinds of levels, including very local levels and national levels, where you work to change the legal framing of how an ecosystem is regarded. We need to move into a century of ecological restoration in order to avoid a great implosion globally and all the catastrophes that would entail. A century of ecological restoration requires binding frameworks that bind upon the corporations, the banks, the governments, all the actors involved. It's kind of macro structural framing in which you can achieve a great deal, but it's best combined with the social movements, collectivities, cooperatives, and so on, community trusts on the ground, water defenders, forest defenders, the defenders are all part of that. That's a part of social struggle dimension and social mobilization and social responsibility collectively. But it's like the legal framework alone is necessary, but not sufficient. And all around the planet, there are these movements which are aggregated also. I encourage everyone to look at the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and their website and see how extensive the cases are from all around the planet, going from one mountain or one river to even one species on Jeju Island in South Korea. And it often involves ordinary people gathered together, but also specialists, academics, some academic institutes, in law and legal studies are involved around the planet. And all of these efforts are recommoning efforts. And sometimes in some places, they're twinned with rewilding. And that's like the most profound form of ecological restoration, is to rewild an entire ecosystem, for example. And these are being done around the planet, and many are in motion. And even there's a twinning with the concept of ecocide and the legal standing of ecocide globally. You can look at the website of Stop Ecocide International, for example, which are the kind of ideal framework of the future, involves an incredible array, a plethora of laws and legal structures for the rights of nature at all these different scales that people have achieved themselves through their own movements, because all of these require social struggle by movements to achieve. And then twinned with globally the law on ecocide to change the Rome statutes. And so therefore the kind of strong deterrent to any actor, a CEO, a head of state, anyone who is found to have wantonly engaged in extremely destructive extractivist practices to destroy ecosystems could be prosecuted. And that will serve as a legal framing for their punishment, but also deterrent for all actors in the system globally, because we have to think in terms of Earth system dynamics. And we know that the only way we can avoid a great implosion a few decades from now is to have a century of ecological restoration. But we need the means and mechanisms to do so. I'm just making a kind of claim that in my mind, and also in my personal life, and maybe some of you will find, it's highly rewarding to join one of these movements which places land in a protected legal framework under community stewardship with active participation in the ecological restoration going on. Sometimes I've been involved with some in Scotland and in the borders of northern England that have been going on for decades, and they have had fantastic success and umpteen thousands of hours of volunteer work, and they have restored whole ecosystems and all the biodiversity that goes with that. We have over 8 million species on this planet, and these are all, as my colleague Marcus Kroger in EXALT calls these existences. And we can no longer, produce the destruction of so many species. We bring the whole system down around us. And so in other words, I just wanted to make a plea for people to look at the website of GARN and maybe join one of the movements on the rights of nature at whatever scale this is. I said it operates at all sorts of scales, which is remarkable. It's a remarkably flexible kind of movement. And see what you make of it and what could be made of it to enforce perpetually the rights of nature and the restoration of ecosystems wherever you live, wherever that is, and at whatever legal framework level that you think that the movements are focusing themselves on or could focus themselves on. Yeah. So I just want to leave it at that.
Yeah.
And so thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to have to cut you short, but we have a big accumulation of questions that I do want to get to, and we still have one speaker, Anja Karina Nygren, who is Professor of Global Development at University of Helsinki, will speak on multi-layered hazards and harms of hydrocarbon extractivism, oil in short. Anja, over to you.
Yeah. Good afternoon for everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Anja Nygren from the University of Helsinki. I just want to share some ideas about multi-layered effects of oil extractivism. We are witnessing a global trend of increased demand for oil, gas, and minerals. Extractivism is deepening beyond the Earth's surface, and at the same time it is anticipated that the deep seabed will be the next resource frontier to be commercially extracted in the quest for hydrocarbons, minerals, and metals. This has huge environmental, social, and economic implications that need closer scrutiny. Oil industry is a mega business. It's still expanding in various parts of the world. 8 of the 30 world's biggest companies ranked by revenue are oil and gas companies. Fossil fuels are also key issues to understand the risk of climate collapse. The study by Kilcale et al., published in Nature in 2025, showed that the 14 world's largest fossil fuel and cement producers contributed to 28% of overall effect of human-made climate warming in 2010-2019. Besides, oil extraction has links to water pollution, land degradation, health risks, and livelihood dispossession. I want to make 3 points here if we want to understand the effects of oil extraction. The first one is that we need a perspective of layered spaces. A horizontal land-centered perspective provides us scant insights into the environmental and social effects of oil extraction. Instead, we need to consider the complex interlinks between the subterranean, terrestrial, atmospheric, and hydrological layers in order to understand the socio-spatial effects and the possible polycrisis associated with fossil fuel production and consumption. As we can see here, even when considering only the domain of subterranean, oil and gas operations are carried out at multiple layers with complex effects. My second point is that we need to consider layered politics. It includes aspects such as land tenure, resource access, territorial control, legislation, and governance. A key aspect here is that in most countries, the US is here an exception, but in most countries, the landowners own just the surface land. The state owns the subterranean. This means that the state grants concessions for oil drilling, and the companies get access to subterranean resources, but not the land ownership. The farmers thus continue to cultivate their land, but the oil extraction restricts their land use. For example, it is prohibited to cultivate perennial crops or trees near oil wells and pipelines. The harms of soil degradation and water pollution also remain with landowners, which often leads to indirect dispossession as smallholders need to search for other livelihood options for poorly producing fields. As you can see in this picture, in many oil fields, the pipelines are crisscrossing the fields and villages, containing a high risk of an oil spill or a gas explosion. My third point, and the final point, is that we need to consider multi-temporality. In the effects of oil extraction, multiple timescales intersect. First, hydrocarbons are non-renewable resources which were formed over millions of years. However, the harms affected by oil extraction are often calculated through a very short-term perspective, where the farmers are compensated by single payments of lost harvests and died animals. It is very difficult to evaluate the slowly accumulating effects on human health and ecological integrity. In addition, multi-millennial timescales need to be taken into account when evaluating the impacts of fossil fuels on climate change. Timothy Mitchell calls this the theft from the future. Related to these multi-millennial consequences, I ask, can we just rely on temporalities that reward short-term thinking and reduce worth to market value? In my view, we need to make decisions that fully consider long-term responsibility towards more sustainable and just futures and act accordingly. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Anja. And this is very interesting. We have a little bit of time left, and probably doesn't matter if we go over time a little bit. I think we started off with 59 participants. We're down to 56. That's very good. So I don't think we're boring too many people. And I think everybody's looking forward to a bit of discussion. I think one thing I wanted to point out is that it seems that some of us are arguing we actually need to go backwards to go forwards. And it's in these days when we're so lost, thinking how are we going to survive the next 50 years with all the risks and threats that we face, humanity. It does pay to remember that we've survived for a very, very long time quite nicely, and I think we need to remember some of the different attitudes, the different fundamental attitudes, the more embedded sort of way of life that we survived with for such a long time. And it's only yesterday, in terms of human history, that we moved to this extractivist model. Not that we don't always need to extract some resources from the environment, but at this scale, in this destructive manner, that's new and it's not the norm if you look at the human story as a whole. So it gives some hope, and there's much we can learn, even though, doesn't mean we have to reject technology, but maybe we need to look deeper. Okay, now let me just go through some of the questions that remain unanswered on the Q&A. Mr. Weyert raises a question that really points at the elephant in the room, that is next generations. That's a very important issue. What kind of world are we leaving to the next generation? And I wonder whether any one of you would like to comment on the sort of intergenerational dimension of extractivism. Audrey, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. And I would also like to link it to what you said before. I think we have kind of two, let's say, dangers. One is that we always think we know what's best for the world, and then we're trying to do something new. And very often that's extractivist and not very sustainable. The other thing is that we romanticize the past. And I think we all should be aware that, the past was not as great as we sometimes think it is. And specifically, a lot of the knowledge that we had, for example, in native knowledge and others, were created in a very different context. We had very little population at the time, a little population density. We know that the life expectancy was low, so we had very different composition of people. So many of the economies that we can see in indigenous country and indigenous knowledge is very well suited for these kind of conditions, but it may not be suited for what we experience today. I mean, if you look, when you look at Indonesia, when we have cities like Jakarta with 12 million people, well, sustenance farming would not work there. And of course, we need to think about next generations. They have to live in a world with 9 to 10 billion people, which is not sustainable in itself. But we need to think about it, and we want to give each individual, in a sense, a right to live. To think about what can we really learn from the past. I think that's very important, because there are a lot of lessons. But how can we be creative to deal with the future challenges? And it is not repeating the past. And I think we should be very careful not to romanticize the past, which had also a lot of inequities, had a lot of problems. But my main point is it was directed towards a context that now is dramatically changing. And whether we like it or not, we need to adjust to that's evolutionary theory. We need to adjust to the conditions, and that also means very innovative and creative spaces. And that's, I think the other questions there was about citizen panels and public participation. I think that's a place where we need to get the creative power, the creative empowerment also of the people on local areas to see where we can go from here to the future, including the past, but also thinking about creative methods of the future. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Well, I was trying to get to that also in, touching on the issue of population increase. It's obviously very traumatic changes, very dramatically changed conditions. And you're right, often you shouldn't romanticize and also look at, let's say the Roman Empire also had, massive deforestation in its core area and exploited the periphery to maintain itself for quite a while before it collapsed. So, it's not so simple. We just perhaps don't quite have the time to go into all that detail. But yes, and still, I think we can learn something from the way um,
Yes.
Former generations lived, yeah, and also lived more modestly. And for example, one question before was about, how can you recycling create more waste? The problem is, of course, waste cycles. So every cycle there's a loss. But previously we had, say, furniture that lasted for centuries, or houses that were built 500 years ago in Europe. You see many of these houses and people still live in them. So, lengthening the cycle of use for products massively reduces the loss. That's often forgotten. But to our technical team, can we promote some of our participants to speakers? Bashir would like to speak and ask a question or comment. Yeah, can you facilitate? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
He could speak now.
Yeah, you can speak. Bashir, please go ahead. Okay. Okay. You seem to be muted at the moment.
Greetings.
Okay.
What a wonderful scholarly work. Thank you very much. It was truly enjoyable and calls for more urgency. I just wanted to provide a quick point on the fact that when we have environmental waivers, environmental impact waivers, there's always a certain fast tracking of, suppressing environmental interests over commercial interests. And this is something very much supported both by local government, but also at national level. So there is a very strong link between white collar crime, in which perhaps an honest intention to create more jobs and contribute to the economy could easily transition into a white collar crime. But then, of course, that would turn into an environmental crime and long term consequences. So perhaps more transparency, as it was stated, and reporting and holding corporations to account. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, internalizing the externalities in a way. Yeah, the externalized costs. That's a very important point. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Clive Spash. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for the webinar. It's very interesting. One of the problems I have, I see.
Oh, oops. Yeah, you're muted, Clive. I'm not sure what happened.
I think I got unmuted now. It's
Yeah.
because I was changed to a presenter. Okay, so basically I thought it was a very interesting seminar, but I feel that there's some contradictions here going on. I mean, Thomas, you just mentioned internalizing externalities, an amazingly mainstream economic concept, I would have to say. And that it's not about internalizing externalities. It's actually that there's cost shifting going on all the time. So corporations actually purposefully shift costs onto others, and that seems to me exactly what was being discussed when you're discussing some of the problems that are going on. The other side of this is that Ortwin is is talking, and I think Richard are talking from very different perspectives about circularity and circular economies from the people who are talking about agriculture and agroforestry. So they're still promoting a modernist conceptualization of extractivism, sustaining the systems, making mining more acceptable and so on. Whereas the agroecologists are talking about closing systems in ways which are very different, which are about animal and food production, which would cycle in accompaniment with an ecosystem. And I think that's what June was talking about as well,
Okay,
and
yeah.
Hamid and so
Yeah.
on. So these
Yeah.
seems to me some basic divisions here, and then I think that the promotion of nature's rights is interesting, but it's also again a very mainstream approach in terms of contract law and seeing a legal system. It's very American. It's a counter to the Americans and that's used in South America. Why? Because you had to counter corporations. Final point. There's some discussion in the Q&A about the role of participation with Ortwin and so on. I've worked with him before. And the thing is that what didn't come up there is that the regulation and the requirements from states is not against corporations as private individuals. Many states have massive corporations. Look at the oil industry and the extractive industries. They are owned by nation states. Very big, 60% or something of the extraction. Look what goes on with Swedish corporations going across Europe. They're actually state-owned. The state is in bed with the capitalist corporate model. It's not a neutral good guy who's coming in from outside.
Okay, just briefly, I agree with you about externalization. It's about shifting costs to the general public and to nature rather than bearing those costs. That's what I meant. But the thing about the resources, the agroecologists, and also, the kind of farmers that I've worked with, these movements, it's very different because we're talking about renewable resources. You can be cyclical there, definitely. I mean, I've worked in parts of Indonesia where people have had intensive rice agriculture for 1,000 years and could quite happily continue ever on. So it's very different from extraction of minerals. I'll hand over to Richard there to talk about how that is different. Richard.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say that it is not that different, actually.
Okay.
So right now it's different because we have not gone through this agricultural revolution of the 50s. But it could be the case. So there are ideas that, for example, that the mine owns the metals it extracted, and you can only lease it. So it means that you would be incentivized to return it back to the mine. So at the end, there is zero impact, net impact on the environment. As I said, you have to think that when you extract minerals, you extract a couple of percent of what you digged out of the mine. So that could be one of the cases. What you also said is that government implied, and it is not the case. Everything is regulated by the market. Of course, the government support the market because it's a way for them to have a better control. But the market is regulating at least the extraction of minerals. And that makes things very complicated. Even if a mine wants to be sustainable, for them it's very difficult to do so because they have to be rentable every year, whereas the life of a mine is 30 years, and then maybe they will be able to remediate and go to the next phase of the mine, which is mine closure. So you have to think at the mine in terms of decades. For the shareholder, it's a yearly problem. And that is what the industry is facing right now. It's not that they don't want to do it. It's that for them, it's impossible to integrate that. And there are ways to do so. And I would argue that, and I'm not here to defend the mining industry, but I think there are as many people wanting to protect the nature, the environment in these industries and any other industry. It's just that right now the system is not favorable for them to do so. But we have the way to we have the duty to make it like that.
Mm-hmm. Richard, FPIC was mentioned a few times. Would you like to comment on that? It was in the chat.
What did I didn't see.
Hold on, let me just raise that on just a second.
Could I just say?
Yeah, I saw
say
that.
Richard, that you know, when you talk about the corporations and so on being willing, or people being willing to head for sustainability, I think you should really look at climate change. Look at climate denialism. Who has funded it? Exxon Valdez, you know, I mean, Exxon Corporation. You know, they fight everything. You look at the number of violations of environmental regulation. The corporations are not interested in sustainability. They are not interested in the environment unless they're forced to do it. Look at what's happening today in America. The corporations ally with fascism. They will ally with anybody who will do what they want. And they have infiltrated the governments of the world very strongly today. And I do not see any environmental agenda in their way of approaching things. It doesn't seem to happen. South American extractivism, corporations are killing environmentalists. They're not cooperating. They're not good guys. And the reason, and you say the market regulates, the market does not regulate. The market is designed institution. And what do we mean by the market? There is no such thing as the market. There are different forms of market with different institutions designed in different ways, in different countries, in different locations, with different laws. So there is no such thing as the market. I'm sorry. Rethink.
Yeah. Look, Clive, I think we all are aware about the impact of inequality and absolutely astronomical levels of inequality that we have now and in recent years. I talked before about consumption in the world and the fact that so many of our resources are really just consumed by the rich countries. But within those countries, in the US, for example, now we have the richest 10% accounting for 50% of the consumption, and the extractivism that is necessary to sustain that. And of course, that inequality also affects democracy. It affects our ability to make rational choices that reflect everybody's interests, not just a few vested interests. So I think that is quite clear. We all confronted with these kinds of stories every day. You know, the recent sort of backtracking on environmental protections in the US, for example. But Richard, some of this was, I think, in your corner of the discussion. Did you?
Yeah, so
the market issue.
I don't think we can make a difference between the different industries. We know, for example, that agriculture or big companies leading agriculture are also involved in criminal activities. Let's go to Indonesia, for example, or Brazil. So I think I would not put one industry more on the pillory than another. But let's go back to. So I saw that there is a question on the treatment of waste and blood minerals. It's a very tricky question because if you look at it, and we have been working with those people. If you say, for example, we don't want to have cobalt or diamond from Africa, which is an alternative, but where do you get it from? That's the first question. The second question is that you have a lot of people depending on this income in these countries. So who is to decide? We as Westerners, because we need it, or we decide we don't want them in such a way, or the local communities, local population have also maybe their says. And if you ask them, they are not as extremist as we are, because they need the income, they need the resources, and they own the resources. It's not we own that resources; they own that. So it's very difficult to say that we should decide. We should also include the local population into this discussion and not decide from our, let's say, ivory towers.
Anja, may I ask, with oil, is there any way oil extraction can be done better, or is this really something that you think, we really have to stop? We have to stop. And it just, I was struck by the oil rig picture that you had, and just the scale of the monstrous scale of this piece of equipment, just the brutality of its sheer size. It's what can we do? What can we do about that? What's your view on the energy transition there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a huge challenge, but I want to just say that there are, for example, some aspects that would be quite easy to somehow change. For example, many of the oil industries, they still use the system of gas flaring. They are flaring the gas 24 hours, 7 days for years, and that contributes to climate warming. There would be other techniques and technologies to use, but many companies do not use it because it's more expensive. Well, I think we really need a certain kind of energy transition, although we know that there are no easy receipts or no easy ways to do it. If I am allowed, I just want to still respond. Thanks for asking about or making a statement about the role of states, which I think is crucial here. But still, if we consider the oil industries, it's also important to remember that the oil reserves, they are mostly owned by states, nation states. But then the oil refining, oil processing, that's mostly in the hands of multinational corporations, and that's the most profitable activity within oil production. So there is also the question of power here. But I definitely do not have any kind of answers how to solve the problems. But if we consider also the very long-term, vast timescales that we need to think when considering the impacts of fossil fuel production, that's a very serious question. Thanks.
Okay. All right. I think we already quite a bit over time, and we need to come to a close. I think I'd like to thank all of the speakers and also the participants for your input. I think it's quite clear that extractivism is very central to the question of existential risk. It clearly is a driver of the polycrisis. It contributes in so many ways to the problems we have, and we need to really unpack that and find ways to break this cycle or this pattern or this particular mode of operation. Barry, would you like to say some final words from the perspective of EXALT?
Well, I mean, I think there is a growing realization that extractivism is at the root of the polycrisis, and that all the drivers in extractivism we need to be addressed. And at this panel, I think that, as Clive pointed out, there are some robust areas for debate, further debate. But I think we have a broad agreement that we're really talking about radical resistance to extractivism as the main alternative to pursue. And advocating a post-extractivist world order is a huge endeavor indeed, and it will require immense social struggle. I think that can never be underestimated. It's like, as we've said, there are extraordinarily unequal relations and extraordinarily powerful actors out there, both private and state, and they need to be brought to book. And people have to reclaim the right to do that, and that can only happen politically. Yeah, there is consciousness changing that has been happening for decades in my lifetime. And we are all just still doing what we can from where we are, and trying desperately to have positive alternatives that actually make transformation, that don't just tinker with the system, as it were. I think maybe we had a robust discussion today, and it to be continued.
Okay, I agree. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and looking forward to seeing you at future extra events. Please subscribe to our newsletter, which you'll find the subscription form on our website, and look forward to seeing you on other occasions. Thank you very much.